science, you compare it with the world around us, every time you find out you can trust the Bible. It's only when you start out with faulty assumptions you come up with faulty answers. I'm going to whip through a few of these fast. The Earth's magnetic field has shown a systematic decrease. In the last 150 years, it's decreased 15%. This has never been explained by natural scientific evidence. All sorts of speculation, all sorts of stories told about it, as we said. But the fact is, our magnetic field is significantly decreasing. If you work that backwards, you find out it would have been impossibly strong 10,000 years ago. It sets the age of the Earth under 10,000 years. It's a very strong evidence. It's never been refuted. And there's these rapid reversals that are apparent in the rock records. That can be explained by a creation model too, and some wonderful papers have been written on it. Can't be explained by evolutionary assumptions. Every culture in the world, this was mentioned earlier, every culture has an acknowledgement that there's been a worldwide flood. And here you get into the real crux of the matter. You see, the Bible talks about a worldwide flood in Genesis extensively and for a large period. I mean, it doesn't spend as much time talking about creation of everything as it does about this worldwide flood. Then it talks about it in Psalms. It talks about it in Proverbs. It talks about it in Job. Jesus Christ mentioned it. He tied the moral condition of the world to the moral condition before the first judgment. And he specifically said the flood came and took them all away. But this is the one that gets me. In 2 Peter, Peter makes a statement that scoffers will come in the last days, saying, all things have considered since they have from the beginning of creation, and they will willfully forget that by the word of God the earth was made out of water, and that the world that then existed perished, being flooded by water. Think of the implications. Remember all those cultures I just showed you? Every culture in the world had an acknowledgement of a flood. For about 5,000 years plus of Earth history, there was a universal acknowledgement that there was a worldwide flood. It's only been in the last 150 years that the scientific community, and it's really just the majority, not all of the scientific community, based on faulty assumptions, has denied that there's been a flood. 5,000 years, universal acknowledgement, 150 years of denial. Guess what days we're in according to the Bible? It's a clear indicator God is getting ready to wrap things up. See, the flood is that bottom line issue. If you really want to know how old the earth is, you can't deny some major event that happened in earth history. Huge layers of geology would have been laid down incredibly rapidly by water washing over the whole surface of the earth. Forests of trees would have been washed up and washed together and buried in sediment that would have turned to coal seams. And when huge flood-like events happen, you don't get just a mixture, a mishmash of everything all blended together. When Mount St. Helens exploded in 1980, an enormous mud flow flowed down the mountain, and you've got fine layers, just fine little layers during this catastrophic flow event that was flowing down the mountain. This whole river valley formed in one day as water that was backed up behind a dam broke through the sediment and carved out this valley. See, that's the kind of thing that was happening during the worldwide flood. And our universe is full of what I call smoking guitars. Smoking cigars. If you walked into a room and that balloon was on the ceiling, and the geology professor was standing at the door to let you into the room, and he said, there has been no one in this room for 10,000 years. Now come on in. You walk in the room and you see this helium balloon sitting on the ceiling. It's obvious evidence that you haven't been told the truth, because the helium would have permeated out, just like the helium in those zircon crystals should have long ago permeated out. It shouldn't be there if they're as old as we're told. And the whole universe is full of these. Spiral galaxies shouldn't still be spiraled up. The moon should have receded further from the Earth than it is. You know, comets should not still be in existence because they lose their material every time they come around the sun. You know, Saturn's rings and Jupiter's moon Io should not still be hot, and they should not still be in the patterns that they're in. unless they're not as old as we're told. All around us we see indicators that things are not as old as we're being led to believe. The most prolific dating method that you hear about constantly is radiocarbon dating, and this is the last one I'll talk about. See, radiocarbon forms as cosmic rays, high-energy rays, come into the atmosphere and they hit a nitrogen molecule, blow it apart. Some of the particles from the nitrogen particles recombine to form a carbon-14 particle, which combines with oxygen to form radioactive CO2, which the plants take in, and they get radioactive carbon in them, and the animals eat the plants, and they get radioactive carbon, and the radioactive carbon gets uniformly spread throughout everything that's alive. And as long as you're alive and you're eating anything, you're taking in radioactive carbon in the same proportion that's in the atmosphere. Well, the thing about radioactive carbon is that we've measured it very accurately, and every 5,720 years, if you stop eating, in 5,720 years, all the cells and all the carbon parts of your body, half of that radioactive carbon will have decayed. So if you measure how much radioactive carbon is left in your body 5,000 years from now, or some unknown, and you have half as much as you have today, you would come to the conclusion that it was 5,730 years since you died. It really makes sense. It's a good dating method. But it makes a huge assumption. Well, I'm going to go back. It assumes that there's always been the same amount of biomatter in the world. You see, God described the world as a paradise before the flood. Huge amounts of water had to have been trapped underneath the earth before the flood. It said the fountains of the great deep broke up. There could easily have been 10 or 100 times as much vegetation. There's no ice caps, no deserts, lots more vegetation. If the same amount of radioactive carbon was forming before the flood, and there was 10 times as much vegetation, then the concentration of radioactive carbon in everything that's alive would have been 10 times less. So if you dated it right after the flood, you would think that a whole bunch of it had disappeared if you made the wrong assumptions. You see, all radiocarbon dating does is assume that there's never been a worldwide flood, and therefore they come up with huge long ages. There's more, I don't have time to go into more detail, but that's the basis, the basic reason why it gives you such a wrong age. It assumes there's never been a flood. Wrong assumptions, wrong answer. But the bigger problem, I'm going to just go through this. The bigger problem is that radiocarbon does disappear. You see, that radioactive carbon, in 5,000 years you have a fourth of it. 10,000 years, there's an eighth of it. 15,000 years later, there's a 16th of the original amount. 20,000 years later, there's a 32nd of the original amount. 25,000 years ago, there's a 64th of the original amount. The fact is, every single atom of radioactive carbon should be gone within 250,000 years. There shouldn't be an atom of it left. If something that used to be alive 250,000 years ago died, by today, if that amount of time had passed, there should be no radioactive carbon left. It should be gone, zero, zip. Modern equipment can measure levels down to 0.001% of the modern amount that's in things that are alive today. There's only one part, and I believe this is correct, per trillion radioactive carbon for every normal carbon atom. And yet we can measure 0.001%. This is absolutely astounding fact of science that's just ignored. Every single molecule on this planet of organic origin contains 0.1 to 0.5% of the modern level of radioactive carbon. Dinosaur bones have 0.3 parts of radioactive carbon. Coal seams from every level in every area of the world have 0.1 to 0.5% of modern radioactive carbon. Fossilized wood, shells, graphite, even things that were never alive have radioactive carbon in them. It shouldn't be there. You know what this is called?